This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, it is another of my shows on the decline of reading. I'm speaking with Chad Post, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Chad Post is my guest. He's a translator and he works for the University of Rochester in New York State. Welcome, Chad. I like to give my guests a few minutes to sort of define who they are, what they do, and why they're here. So if you could give a little précis of who you are.
Oh boy, I will do my best. First of all, thank you for having me. This is really exciting to talk about this topic and I'm excited to get into that. Real quick, I don't translate. I have to step back and say
Okay.
I'm not of that level. I'm an editor of a lot of translations though. I started out my career working at bookstores and promoting works that were experimental, more avant-garde, like Delkey Archive titles, a lot of international literature, and then worked for Delkey Archive for 6 years as associate director at the end, helping foster that sort of reading community. Then left there and moved here to Rochester, the University of Rochester, to found Open Letter Books, which has been going. Our first book came out in September of 2008, so it'll be 17 years this next month, I guess. And Open Letter is dedicated to doing only literature and translation. So I've edited, I don't know, probably like 250 books of translation at this point in time. Maybe even more than that. I've totally lost count. But I do that because I really love international books. I love like the sharing of like ideas across cultures. But I also think that a lot of the books that I've been most interested in from like an aesthetic perspective, tend to be written by writers from other countries. That there's a lot of like formal experimentation, use of language, use of point of view that is that American writers could learn from. Not that American writers are bad, not that American literature is bad. I just find like some of the innovations and experiments in other countries to be more exciting and more freeing in a way. Like there's maybe something to dovetail with our conversation is that I think there's more leeway given to experimentation in other countries. And in their literary scenes, because people are maybe closer readers or better readers, that they don't have a certain level of expectation that comes with the kind of like generic stereotyping MFA level book, which has a certain sort of sheen to it. Anyways, here at Open Letter, we publish 10 books a year, but we do a website that was called 3% and is now a Substack. That is the 3% problem, that Substack. And that is dedicated to fostering a community among all these disparate pieces, the authors, the translators, the booksellers, the reviewers, the writers, or the readers, everyone kind of coming together and trying to like learn more about these type of books. That includes a couple of podcasts, the 3% podcast, the 2-month review podcast, and founded the translation database to actually get data on what's being published in translation. And for a long time, we ran the Best Translated Book Award, which went up through 2020 and then ceased because of the pandemic and because both the National Book Critics Circle and National Book Awards had started translated words for translated literature, which didn't exist when the Best Translated Book Awards started. So in some ways, we kind of fulfilled our purpose. So that's on hiatus. But generally, like, they do a lot. Like, I spend a lot of time working on and thinking about books, and I do teach here at the university. So I work a lot with students, both in terms of learning how to get into publishing and the book world generally, and then about how to read, interpret, and edit translations. So maybe that's a quick summary. I also love baseball. There's a fun fact, not a super fun fact, but a fact that's outside of my normal work life. But a lot of stuff is just based around reading books.
When I saw your resume and I saw the Delkey Archives, I hadn't thought about that press for like 25 years. I didn't even know they were still around.
Yeah, it is. It's been revitalized. It's a complicated, long story, but in 2020, before 2020, John O'Brien, the founder, and I had a falling out that led to me being here at Rochester. We patched that all up and worked together to try and secure the future of Delkey. It is now currently being managed by Deep Bellum in Texas and being kind of configured, fits and starts, up and downs. It exists, but a lot of the best works are from the period that you would have known.
So I've done one show before with another fellow who was outside the literary area. He was military, and he had his own philosophy. One of the things that there's a lot of links to if you Google decline of reading is the decline of reading for so-called pleasure. I'm
Yes.
more interested, though, in what I call illiteracy versus deliteracy. Illiteracy, obviously, you can't read. You
Yeah.
read very poorly. For me, deliteracy is the active choice to read nothing but crap. Now, there's nothing. Most films, most art, most whatever in the human endeavor is going to be bad. And so if you go with the mindset that 5% of it's going to be good or better and 95% of it should be flushed down the toilet, that's one thing. But it seems to me that that's the ratio is generally reversed, is that the 95% is constantly being pushed across all areas, but we'll talk about writing and reading first. So to me, deliteracy is actively choosing to, instead of, if you're a sci-fi fan, reading some of the classics like
Yeah.
Asimov or Heinlein, you're reading about fantasy princesses on dragons with overflowing bosoms and stuff. So do you recognize the difference between an inability to actually read, but being able to read and choosing to just empty calories?
Yeah, I think I think that you're right. You're generally right. I generally agree with everything you're saying, and I have a lot to say about that kind of opportunity. I think as a overall like bird's eye view, I think it might be more bell curvy, where like the top 5% of stuff that's coming out is excellent. The bottom 5% is totally like should not exist. But then there's this middle section that's most everything. And that middle section that's so middle mindy and like just like water isn't going to have a lasting impact, isn't changing the game in any significant way. I think that's where most of the readers reside. And I think that one of the problems when you mentioned like reading the classic authors and identifying like who is important to have read, a lot of the signposts that we had growing up are gone, or that I had growing up are gone. And I keep pointing back to, and it's sort of a cheat, but pointing back to the pandemic times, because that was one time that we did face suddenly this like weird idea of like what is our contemporary memory like. Things get like very shuffled around that time. There's a lot of like due to like the trauma of it, like as a society, there's sort of a deadening. Then there's like a sudden disconnect. Things seem very disconnected, like before the pandemic hit and then after. And like right around that area, like a couple years on either side, like everything's kind of washed away. I only bring this up because personally I have this issue, but I've seen it in my students in the times before and after. Before, there was more of an awareness. Like I would bring up authors in classes like, say, James Joyce, say Flaubert, say Beckett, Kafka, and people would, if not be familiar with them, would at least be like, oh, that's someone I've heard of that I should know. They're important. After that point in time, it seems like people just don't know and don't care to know. And I think that some of the guiding rails that we had in culture that aren't connected to the pandemic idea, but like book reviews, like more like even back in the day when we had more literary weblogs that have been like kind of subsumed and destroyed in their own various ways, there used to be a lot more elements where you could learn about things that were, not of the moment in terms of capitalist enterprises. So if anything's going to get any attention today, it's going to be Crown of Thorns and Roses and whatever. You know what I'm talking about? That is like the fairy sexual big series of the moment by Sarah Moss. That's going to get a lot of attention because it's kind of in that middle area. It's for sale now. It's selling well. Everyone will talk about that. Who were her influences? Where did her ideas come from? Even if we say like the books are not great, they're not well written, they're whatever, they're just popcorn culture. She probably had influences on her. Maybe she has read Heinlein. Maybe she has read like these other people. I don't think that the contemporary reader that's engaging with those books has any idea what those are. And I don't think that the culture is serving them from like an educational or like becoming more literate in the way that you're talking about. Like not that can you read it, but like can you understand the kind of context and like the history of it? I don't think there's anyone like really putting that forth in a way that's like useful to the average reader these days. It's just go buy this book. Here's a new book that's like that book. Buy this book. Buy this book. And those things start to feel very disconnected from any sort of other history to the point where like anything from like the Dalkey era, I can mention like so many authors, and even like the most like people I really respect that work at bookstores that are very reader, like people who are big readers will have no idea what I'm talking about. Gilbert Sorrentino, Stanley Elkin, even like Gertrude Stein's Making Americans, it's just like a wash. And so I think that what like my experiences dovetails with what you're saying, although I'm not entirely sure how to exactly define it. Like I like your word deliteracy because I think that's true, that people have like moved away from anything that's a challenge and are being sort of coerced into this more like digestible entertainment value. That if you're going to spend your free time on books, make sure it's like as simply entertaining and has no prerequisites and doesn't require a lot of effort to it.
Recently, I was reading stuff about people up in arms about AI writing, and it's like writing has and reading has have suffered long before AI came along, and what's called AI now isn't really AI. If you look into it, it's what called LLMs, large language models.
Yes.
But I think back to the 19th and through the mid 20th century, most writers in America and even in Europe and possibly other parts of the world had spent time as journalists too. So they had a
Yeah.
sense of how to tell a story, how to tell stories about odd characters in different ways. And then after World War II, here in the US especially, we got the sort of Henry Ford model of the MFA, where everyone in 6 weeks, figuratively, could become Emily Dickinson if they wanted to. And it just doesn't work like that. And hearing you mention Flaubert, it got me thinking about my wife and I were talking a few months ago that Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina were, in essence, very similar books. We both preferred Bovary because it's a shorter
Oh,
book. It's a
really?
little bit more poetic.
Fair.
And similarly, I've always thought that Slaughterhouse-Five and Gravity's Rainbow were the same book, except Vonnegut does it in one-fifth the time and with a lot more humor. But most people don't have the ability to even make that kind of distinction, much less even recognize that they should read Bovary or Karenina. Even if you don't like it or don't think it's as good as advertised, it's good to read these things so that you have a basis upon which to say, okay, here's Anna Karenina. People say it's up here. I say it's down here. Now, where do I put Moby Dick?
Right. And that like depends upon people knowing who all those authors are and having like the motivation to want to know that. Like the motivation for knowledge has shifted a lot over the past 20 years through the use of smartphones and these other technologies. Like what do you need to know? What do you want to know? Why like I think there's like an existential question of like why spend the time reading these big dense books when you can just Google a Reddit list of like the top 10 books and just have enough information to talk at a party. I do love Vonnegut and Pynchon. I do have a Pynchon tattoo, and I am leading a podcast about Vineland right now, so I am a massive Gravity's Rainbow fan. but I take your point. I do have a funny story about that you'll appreciate. I think you'll really appreciate this. Is that Harvey Pekar used to call the Delkey office when I worked there every Friday. Like he'd just call every Friday. I'd answer the phone, and every Friday he would say, "My name's Harvey Pekar. You might not know who I am. I wrote a comic book called American Splendor, and I've reviewed Delkey books in the past." And I'd be like, "Harvey, it's Chad. I talk to you literally every week." He's like, "Oh, okay." And one time he was just on one of his bits, and like he'd just get on these benders and go, and he's like, and all these people talking about Thomas Pynchon like he's some genius. The guy takes 18 years to write a fucking book, and all he does is look up the capital of North Dakota, and everyone thinks he's so smart. It's like such a good like little dig at like the little minutia of the Thomas Pynchon world. But I think with the relation you're saying, I don't understand, and this is like because I feel like I can very easily fall into like the old man screaming at contemporary culture moment with this, where I'm like, students don't read anything, they don't care, they don't know, and I want to give them like some credit that the world has shifted, that there's something other than like these people are doing something that I don't agree with, but something has changed. And I don't understand the motivation that has been lost in between the time when I was in college, which now feels like, I don't even know, is 100 years ago, right? Like clearly it was 30 years ago. And at that point in time, and when I started working in publishing, if you didn't know all this stuff, that was shameful. Like if you weren't, like I remember being at like a book expo and someone referencing, I forget, like there'd be a reference to like an author, like Céline. Céline is an exact one I'm thinking of. Céline, where they're like, oh yeah, Death of an Installment Plan, this book is like this, blah, blah, that's one of the best books ever written. And I was like, I've not read that. So I like had to fake it through the conversation, then immediately went and read that because that was like a lack, like something that you wanted to address. When I started working in publishing, it was like reading everything I could all the time to know stuff. I feel like there's a different part of culture now where the emphasis isn't on like that sort of level of grand knowledge and like dedication, but is like what can you get by with, and like what are you being paid for? If you're not getting paid to do it, why bother? Like if it's not benefiting you directly, why bother? And I don't know where to put that blame for that attitude, or if that attitude is exactly, if I'm summing it up correctly, but there's something there of like this, like there's no drive to like have that kind of discussion that you're talking about. Like I would love to sit in a bar and randomly talk to someone about Ulysses and whether they like it or not, and like what they don't like. But instead there's like, if I were to I did bring that up in a bar once on Bloomsday, and someone's like, well, that's not a real book, right? And I was like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, it's not like the Bible. And I was like, okay, I can't have a conversation. This is not going to go anywhere well for me. There's something weird.
See, with something like that, though, I would go even a little further. I'd say, why don't we discuss whether or not Ulysses is a great book or not, rather than whether you like it? Because I've always been, especially when I see film reviews, I don't really care what someone likes because I can't get inside that person's head or heart or know it. But if you can tell me reference that my brain can get to, and you say, well, this scene is like from the Odessa Steps scene in Battleship Potemkin or something, I can have a frame of reference to do that.
Yes.
Now, a lot of the excuses that you hear for why reading is down, that people will say, well, there's a lot more distractions. In the last 100 years, we have radio, TV, film, internet, PC games, cable TV, etc. And there's certain truth to that. I think in certain areas, for example, I do a podcast with a fellow about the history of television and American television. And, if you go back to the early 70s, CBS on a Friday night used to have All in the Family, MASH, Bob Newhart, Mary Tyler Moore, Bob Newhart, and Carol Burnett on the same night. This is like 5 of the top 20 greatest comedy shows ever. And I think it's fair to say you'll never have that again, because there you only had 3 networks, X amount of shows, and you had a population of 170 million. Now, 50 years later, the population has doubled, and you've got 50 times as many outlets. So you cannot literally have as many good writers or cinematographers or whatever for that. I think that works in some cases. I don't think that works when it comes to reading, though, because when you're reading, you're alone with the book. You don't have to worry about do we have the best cinematographer in to film that particular scene, and so when we are alone with the book, I've been of the persuasion that if good art or great art has beneficial things for you, bad art is the negative. It's the stuff that's going to clog your veins and make your brain eventually just stop functioning. So where do you sit on that spectrum? Do you if you read something bad, especially if it's, I'll give you an example. I read The Road by Cormac McCarthy about 15 years ago. I read it literally. It's a short book. I read it in 45, 50 minutes while my wife was browsing elsewhere in the bookstore. And having watched The Twilight Zone, this was a bad episode of The Twilight Zone. And no one there were some negative reviews that it was thin compared to some of his other stuff, but no one would come out and say it, because if we criticize Cormac McCarthy, we're done.
There are a couple threads to pick apart there. First of all, I hate the ending of The Road. I think it's terrible, and I think that makes the whole book terrible. So I completely agree with you on that, and have always wondered why there wasn't more criticism. No, actually, I don't wonder why there isn't more criticism. It's what you say. There's the people that once you get lauded, once you get to a certain thing, whatever you do is perfect. It's great. It's excellent. There's no questions. And everyone has that group think of we want to be part of the crowd, so we must be one of the people who support this. This happened with the book The Vegetarian by Han Kang, where a lot of people are talking about how great the translation is, none of whom read Korean. It became a controversy of what are you saying when you say this is a great translation? What is the actual lines that you're pointing to? You're just saying this because everyone else said it? Right now, Ocean Byung is having a huge blowback because he had gotten so much praise and so much put into that category that nobody questioned his books. And then someone from, I believe it was TLS, started saying like, if you look at this is not good writing. This is not accomplishing what people are saying it does. They're just saying these empty words. So there is that sort of like the grouping around a sort of like mediocre to bad piece of art, but that is one that people have pumped up for one reason or another, because of the author's reputation and power, because of like the feeling of being left out of something if you're not into it. And that's very potent within like a capitalist publishing enterprise. The more that you can get that to happen, the more sales you get, and that's what you care about. There's like a real shift at some point in time that goes from like even nonprofits and small presses being about like, we're going to make great literature that's not going to sell very well, but it's important and it's great, and we stand by it. With integrity, honesty, and like authenticity, we want to publish this sort of book.
New Directions was founded on all of that 70 years ago.
And I think that they're still one of the ones that are close to that, as close as you can get to that for like our given moment. I think there's a lot of other ones that are no longer that are like, how can we be like a commercial press, making these sort of sales, making this sort of money, getting this sort of attention, but just be poor at it, just be, not as well funded. And that's not right. I think that there was like the dedication to like the book as art. There's some words thrown at it sometimes, some mission statements tossed its way, but there's like, it doesn't appear within the actual enterprise in a valid way. So like that idea of like having everyone like hooked in to like a certain book that can sell is super powerful to like that impulse, that like stay afloat, have a success impulse. And it leads to like really pushing things that are mediocre, because generally speaking, great books don't get a lot of attention. They don't get a lot of sales. You can use Gravity's Rainbow as like a weird sort of counterexample or example. It wins the National Book Award or shares it. And then, it's very popular in its own way. But how many people do you know have read Gravity's Rainbow within the past year? Like, it's not that popular. It's to the point that Vineland is out of stock from Penguin, doesn't have it. There's a movie coming out about it in like 1 month. And like, they don't even have it in print. They haven't had it in print in like a year. Like,
well,
it's weird.
Aren't most of the books that are given big play, whether it's by an Eggers or by a Foster Wallace or by a Pynchon, most of them are bought by college libraries, to fit so that they have them. Most of them, I mean, I would bet that 80 to 90% of the sales of, Gravity's Rainbow over the 50 years or any of those others have been from colleges, not from people walking and saying, oh, I mean, yes, some people want to have big books, Oh, I've got the 3-volume Proust's Remembrance of Things Past before it became In Search of Lost Time again. But because it looks good, it looks good on the shelf. But it's basically a glorified paperweight.
I mean, I think there's a good set of readers that, I mean, but I guess another way to put this then, or another way to like kind of cut this apart. Say there's like 5,000 people who want to own Gravity's Rainbow and whatever example you want to use there. David's book, Infinite Jest, you want to use Ulysses, whatever. Like there's like these kind of books that are difficult, that are like high literature. There's like 5,000 people. I think it was James Laughlin that used to say there's a maximum of 20,000 literary readers in America at any point in time. Maximum. And that they won't all want to read the same book, but you're not going to get beyond that with like your traditional like highly literary book. So if there's like 5,000 people who want to read like the Gravity's Rainbow, to stick with this example, they deserve to be served and they have their existence. They're not enough to move a needle though, right? Like they are going to be sort of ignored and be like not really catered to and not really necessarily part of like one's marketing strategy. Now they're reading those books and they have to put in a lot of time and effort in order to read those, and are kind of disconnected from everyone else. Like when we're talking about reading being a solitary pleasure, it very much is. And yet there's still that pull to read those mass popular books that are for entertainment, that are, not as crafted, not as like well executed, because at least someone else will have read it. Like even when we talked about the American TV, that platform, for me, like one of the last shows that sort of fits this mold was Lost, which I was involved with tangentially through book stuff. So it's like, this isn't to speak from that point of view, but there was a lot of people watching that, 16 million people viewing like an episode every whatever day it was, Wednesday, Thursday. That's massive by our standards today. Everything broke. Like there's not going to be those numbers anymore. There's too much like diffusion. And so when there is like a show like Sopranos, or I don't know if there's one more recently, like Stranger Things, I suppose that's old too, but you know what I mean, like one of those shows that's kind of the hot button water cooler show, it feels like everyone is watching it because on some base level that we don't even necessarily acknowledge, we do want to be part of some sort of literary or some sort of artistic, some sort of cultural community, a cultural community. And books are hard to make that work in a world in which libraries, you mentioned the school libraries, university libraries have no money anymore. Like it is stripped to the bone. And we are living in an administration that really does want to kill all like cultural learning, all cultural experience that can benefit you and make your brain better. They don't want that to exist. They don't fund any literary publishers anymore, any art. I mean, the NEA is gone. All the libraries are under attack. I can't check out ebooks from the New York Public Library anymore because their app is canceled due to funding. Like there's a way of like breaking that all down to the point where like if you're going to read anything and know about it, it's going to be like the most mass marketed thing that you can possibly get. Actually, what it's going to be is a bunch of shitty airport books that are like those one idea books, like the 4-Hour Work Week or whatever. Like that's what people will be reading, and that will make them dumber.
Let me just since you brought up these cable shows, let me just give some examples in literature that I think are connected. Whenever you read about cable shows, I'm not a believer in that the last 20 years have been a golden age. You mentioned Lost. You want something really smart? Watch The Prisoner, Patrick McGowan from the 1960s. I
love that show. It's amazing.
It's on a totally different level than Lost.
Yeah.
But now, Mad Men and Sopranos. I grew up in a very Goodfellas neighborhood. The Sopranos, you know, it's no more real than Goodfellas was, nor the operatic Godfather. It's just different bullshit Hollywood visions of that. Mad Men was the first 3 seasons I thought was a good soap opera, but it was a soap opera. It wasn't something deep and profound. It was about guys chasing TNA in the 1960s, you know. Now, the thing is, when people rank, the greatest shows of all time, I recently saw this on a break at work looking on my phone. There wasn't a single show before 1990 listed. The Odd Couple wasn't there. The Prisoner wasn't there. Barney Miller wasn't there. Cheers wasn't there, etc., etc. And I find the same thing that goes on with the Infinite Jests and the Eggers and this kind of stuff is that people want to believe that there are giants striding the earth. But I'm sorry, while James Joyce, there are things I can pick here and there. His best stuff, I think his best thing he ever wrote was The Dead, and the ending of The Dead is one of the great endings in literature. It's just not at the same level. But because we have this thing, maybe it goes back an extra 20 years to the 1970 or so. When you look at greatest books of all time, you get a lot of these stuff that haven't stood this test of time being smushed in with stuff from the 19th century or the early 20th century. And if you talk about difficult, I'm sorry, but I didn't find Infinite Jest difficult at all. I breezed through it. It's like there's no air resistance. Good writing makes me want to stop and go back and read that passage again. If I'm just going through like a supersonic jet, there's nothing there that's catching my interest. It's not the wordplay. It's not the ideation. Because I've always said, ideation plus execution equals creation. You have those two ingredients, you got something. I'll give you another example. A decade ago, Colson Whitehead wrote the book about the Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
Making it an actual railroad. Again, this is a bad Twilight Zone episode. And when I read this, I'm like, the only reason he didn't get ripped apart and get stuff is because he was black. A white person who would have dared to do that would have been torn to shreds. And again, it's not that he's black. It's the writing there and the idea and the characterization, like with the Road by McCarthy, was straight pop cultural pablum for me. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. There's you brought up 2 points that come to mind. The Colson Whitehead, I read that book too. I've read a few of his books. I really like him. I think he's a great person. No shade to him. That book I had problems with too because I saw it as being just like a series of little vignettes. Like it was less like of a novel and more of just like set pieces, right? As it moved from like place to place through the Underground Railroad. And that might speak to your attention question from before. Like, is that part of a strategy that if people don't have a lot of attention, asking them to have something that does require resistance, time, effort, that's going to be tough to manage. I also wonder in this like pushing towards the new, like there is always that sort of it's weird. There's a tension where like with those lists, with like the way that people talk about it, if you're saying what are the best, whatever, it squishes to like the past 20 years. Like everything great has happened recently, and everything in the past starts to get lost. And I think that's really what we're talking about in this, is that there's a value to these things that have been back here. Knowing a lot of books that came out in between 1920 and 1960 will make you a great reader and teach you things that you otherwise wouldn't get by reading things that came out in the past 20 years. And I wonder how much of that does tie into the sort of push among like the academy and among like popular like kind of cultural commentary on like questioning the language, the representation, the things from the past. Like any of these books that have questions of like how they address like race, how they address like homosexuality, how they address anything that when the time were like just like part of the scene, but now can be pointed to as like, it's pretty offensive. Like when you stand back from our point of view, that may have helped in like create more of this division. That stuff is easy to ignore because it was like, it's not woke, it's not like right. And there's a little something like, sure, I don't disrespect that opinion, but I think you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater sort of situation where you can use books as like a time machine. What was things like when Jane Austen was alive? Like reading it through that lens for that particular issue, and then looking at what is the craft. How did this book get made? What is it doing? What is she trying to do? Not so much do you like it or not, which you had mentioned earlier, and which is like a huge sticking point for me in my classes. When I have them read anything, the first reaction is, well, I didn't like it. I didn't think that I didn't have any fun reading this. I didn't enjoy it. I didn't like this character. This isn't a book that I would read. I don't like, it's all based on I enjoy. And I've had this ongoing argument that I've sort of slowly been perfecting to get them to like try and meet a book where it is. That I don't give a shit about your feelings, honestly. Like I don't care if you like a book or not. But if you can't talk about it intelligently, then don't be here. Like figure out what the book is doing, like what you're saying, of like what parts work, where are they connected to, what's happening here. And then you can be like, it's not my thing, but I see it, and I've taken away some certain things from it.
Well, it's the thing, like, you know, I'm not a Trump fan. I can't stand the right wing in this country. And everything. I could go off for hours talking about that.
Same.
But by the one thing, I once heard someone say, I'm not going to read that book. It's called The N-Word of the Narcissus by Joseph Conrad.
Oh,
now,
yeah,
I think I can get away with saying nigger of the Narcissus because it's the framework. But if they bleep me or something, but just that kind of mindset to me is just handing on a platter to these troglodytes who you know, your average right-wing troll is not ever going to have read Joseph Conrad, but you're just handing a gift to these people with this fake sensitivity. The same thing I was just reading an hour or so before we talked about Huckleberry Finn, and they're saying, you know, well, was Huckleberry Finn the character, not the book, the character racist? Of course he was. He was a young white boy in 1840s America. Same thing where like people talk about Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was of course he was. He grew up in the 19th century. But you judge the man by how much above that bar he rose and did against that, even having those faults.
Within that book, that is kind of the main point of that book. Yeah. Is like this transformation, is awareness making of the character to a different world. Like, and that's one of the things. I remember this huge controversy from a few years ago, probably like 8 years ago now, but about a YA book in which it was a trilogy. The first volume had been like sent out as review copies to people on Goodreads, and there's a huge YA backlash because the character, it was like some sci-fi book with different races. Some races don't like other races from other moons or whatever it might be, and the main character was like, you know, adamantly opposed to like the Martians, the Venusians, whatever it was. And the criticisms were like, this person they're racist in the sci-fi context, and they do not become aware of that until they start to at the end of volume 1. And this book got canceled, and like the other books never came out. And the whole thing was like, yeah, it's a fucking trilogy. It's going to go through these stages. The character will evolve over the course of this. But like, they're like, no, it wasn't fast enough. It was the character is anti-Martian for too long. And that is really problematic to try and deal with in this day and age. And again, with you, I don't care for the right wing. You know, I really hate Trump. I really hate Elon Musk. But there is a bit of like, the left's also got a lot of problems, and there's certain part of it that's real annoying about this and doesn't and sort of ruins it for everyone.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. I forget the name of the lady who wrote Brokeback Mountain, the short story. To me, it was a bad short story, not because it was politically correct, but because it seemed to me she had never met a homosexual male in her lifetime. There was nothing real about it. It was just sort of this fantasy that she made up without having. Now, you can do that, and if you're just trying to make a one-dimensional point about something, and it's something like To Kill a Mockingbird, which I think is a very overrated book. It's very simple-minded compared to other works that, like Huckleberry Finn, even I think is a far greater book. But what would you say to someone like that regarding what I just mentioned?
That's funny because I've never read Brokeback Mountain nor seen the movie at all. But like, I do think that, yeah, there's that kind of tension between like, yes, you should be able to write about whatever you want. You shouldn't be restricted to like only writing your particular demographic and identity politics. That becomes really dicey if you're like restricted in that way. At the same time, when things are thin and don't work out, they should, you know, theoretically, the like sort of criticism world and the people who are interested in book culture in that way will like, that'll come out in the wash. It'd be like, that doesn't stay around because it isn't satisfying for all these different reasons. The fact that group of people, of like the sort of what we probably would have called like gatekeepers, the reviewers, the critics, the people who are, you know, making these decisions and talking about them and writing about them and really like analyzing this, that's not really here anymore. All that's been gutted. Like the book reviews don't exist. Like everything's just like just a very, very, very pale aspect of what it was even 20 years ago. So like having the reactions to those books that would complicate one's immediate feelings or like raise questions, I again don't think that most of like the readers today come across that. It's just blind. I got this book, I walked in the store, I've heard this name. It's just like that and unquestioning. It's just like Netflix. It's just like a thing to have. And I feel like that reading really suffers because there is a lack of pushing for the highly advanced, complicated, it doesn't even have to be complicated, but really well executed, like your formula from before. By pushing more of that, you would start to like have more of a scene surrounding it and more people engage with that. But instead, we don't have anyone pushing anything aside from for sales. There's not really a real critical mass anymore of critics, so to speak. I mean, I know there's a push for it. I know Merve, what's her name? I'm blanking out. Merve, can't think of it, but who writes a lot, you know what I'm talking about, for the New York Review of Books and for elsewhere, who's very, very brilliant and has a podcast about critics and book criticism, that there is like an awareness and like there are people out there, but it's not like what it was, man. It's just so much different.
Have you ever read anything by Evan S. Connell?
A million years ago, yes. Okay. Back when I was at Delkey, I read a couple of his books from the library, but that's 25 years.
His two greatest books are probably Mr. and Mrs. Bridge.
Mr. and Mrs. Bridge, yeah.
But he also wrote a book called Diary of a Rapist. Now, I'm sure that if that came out nowadays, it probably wouldn't be published simply because of the title or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's a deeply flawed book, just like Brokeback Mountain. Evan S., again, I grew up in a Goodfellas neighborhood. I knew psychopaths. I knew two brothers who tried to rape a retarded girl or a mentally challenged girl. This book is a Hollywood fantasy of what a rapist is like. It reminds me sort of a gentler version of that, if you ever saw the movie with Burt Lancaster, The Swimmer, based on the New Yorker story. That's I think a good solid story, and it's a good solid film, but it's not quite great. But Diary of a Rapist just goes awry in so many ways, other than its subject matter. But now people would say, we're not even going to look at it because of the subject matter. Because the
Yeah.
hero, the quote unquote hero in his own mind, is the rapist.
Yeah, and I think it's all a little complicated too, because like it's not like you can't reissue that book. Like somebody could reissue that book and it wouldn't be like prevented. I think that it would be, and I don't even know that anyone would raise a big fuss about it. It just would be ignored. And that's like that's sort of the death knell of things. Like you don't even get the controversy, you just get ignored, and that doesn't help the case of wanting to publish it. Like I I hesitate, like I always push back a little bit against like the kind of like, well, you can't say these things anymore, you can't do these things anymore, because I think you can, and I think some of that's really overblown. It's just that like it's not going to function under what we consider being successful in our current society. Like it won't sell enough copies, it won't get the attention, it'll just like fade away. So why bother doing it? So it becomes like a form of self-censorship more than like you can do it because it's that. One of the things that maybe, I don't know if you get amusement out of this or not, but that I thought was very weird was the New York Times reporting on Epstein and being like, oh, he has like a first edition of Lolita on display in his apartment. And I was like, that's fine. I know why you're doing this, but like, what a weird, like you've just now been like, oh yeah, Lolita, that like, that, you know, pedophile book. And it's like, Jesus Christ, like that book is so much different than what you're categorizing it as in this headline, but you're hitting that trigger word for a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, pedophile, Lolita, get it. And that's like, I find that very dangerous, but I think that that's how things get treated. Like the Diary of a Rapist would never be read. It would just be like, oh, look, it's a dirty book about a rapist. And you're like, okay, I get it. I'm not going to read that. And that's kind of where it all kind of pushes down on it, more so than like people being like, you can't possibly do that.
I want to step back a moment from the talk of qualitative stuff that we've been talking about mostly, and do go to sort of the lack of reading, even when it comes to soup cans, let's say. I had my website, Cosmoetica.com, I started in '01, and for about the first 15 years, I wrote essays for it. There's about 1,800 essays online. I wrote probably about 1,300 of them and got 500 or so from other people. And I would get, there was some, I did one on JFK that got probably 50, 70, 80 million reads or eyes on it, whatever you want to call it. Then when I just sort of got tired of doing that, I switched over to doing these interviews for the last decade or so. And YouTube, just sitting back passively and just watching stuff, although not many people watch two people talk intelligently, I went from getting millions of hits for the reading to just 100 to 500 to maybe 1,000 in a year for doing these interviews. And
Yeah.
the thing is, even in this quarter century that my website has been around, or in one form or another, I'd be stupid to say that this isn't because people aren't reading less. They certainly are. I mean, if we were talking 2-3 times, maybe even 5 or 10 times, but we're talking 100-fold, 1,000-fold difference. People just want total stimulation, and even a show like this, which is probably going to go 60, 70 minutes or so, they just want 8-minute videos. I remember seeing a video from 5 or 6 years ago, a 14-year-old girl putting on makeup, 23 million views in 2 weeks.
Yep.
That girl isn't ever going to be reading Lolita or Diary of a Rapist or anything pro or con. Even though this is against what I initially said, why do you think that the reading itself for anything has gone so awry? Because I work in retail, and people come up, they'll say, is this what is this? What does this mean? And I say, you read it. And these aren't people speaking Hungarian to me.
Yeah. This is one of my like pro Chat GPT moments where I get a lot of messages or submissions from various like new or like cover letters to like articles or essays for class, where I'm like, do please use Chat GPT, because at least it will be more close to readable than the stuff that I'm getting, which just sounds illiterate from its core. I have a suspicion, I have like a kind of a half-assed theory that I'm kind of going to develop on the fly, is that there are a couple elements as to why the reading has declined so much. I mean, we all know, I think the number came out not that long ago, that it's like 16% of people said that in America said they read a book for fun last year. There's always this like less than 25% read more than one full book in a year. What that book is probably not going to be anything that we're talking about, good or bad, but within that category, it's not going to be there. And one part of it is that we talked about the distraction factor, and I know that people do have, especially younger generations, do have a very hard time only focusing on one thing for a considerable period. And to get the most enjoyment out of a book, it's not the reading for like 3 minutes and then moving on. Reading a book for like a sustained period, even if it's half an hour, 20 minutes, that will get you into the flow of that book. Like you get to accept like the flow of what it is, how it's constructed. You start to like feel it. You start to sync up. 20 minutes is an incredibly long time for people now. Like to not stop and be like, what's on my phone, or what's going on? Is something happened? I got an alert. Like there's like that invasion is there. So like being able to concentrate is one thing. The other is that we all do have these phones, and a lot of the quote unquote reading, because there's always that messy like, well, the kids do read as much as everyone else does. They read just as much as they always have. It's just that they're reading like text on Instagram or like a post on here, which is like a totally different form of reading. But that shit is free. After you've got the phone and you've got the stuff, all of that is there endlessly for free. To go out and buy a book is like a crazy ask. Even though we're like constantly like, Amazon can just supply anything, ebooks exist, I can order a book on here as we talk and have it. Like everything's available, but it is still like, do you want to go pay $24 from a bookstore to go get like a 600-page book that will take you probably like 3 years to read because of the time constraints? They're just like, well, I choose not to. Yeah. Like, and the community's not supportive of it. It doesn't seem like something that you'd be like, yeah, I want to invest in that. And it makes it hard because there are so much. There's just so many books that like even when there is like really something really good is going to get washed away just simply because there's just too many things as well.
Yeah, and it's the great irony that in the age where we have the Internet Archive and we have Project Gutenberg, and you know, now the public domain goes back to what, 1930, with anything before 1930 is free worldwide, basically. There should be a golden age. There should be an absolute, forget writing, the golden age of readers to be able to, I mean, I would have to wait 2-3 weeks sometimes as a kid to get a book. I read mostly nonfiction, a book on astronomy. Like there was a book called Cauldrons in the Cosmos that I loved that I read 3 or 4 times. But then as I got a little bit older, I started reading more fiction and whatnot, and poetry and so forth. But the more available it is, the more people are like, eh.
Yeah. It's very weird. And like there are so many, like when you're talking about the YouTube video too, like a lot of everything's kind of divorced from content on some level. It is like we complain a lot about the algorithm. Once the algorithm takes over, the algorithm gives you this, the algorithm dictates that. And that is very true. I mean, it's obviously like a huge influence on what you see, but you can still self-direct, right? And you can go to like look for, like I only look for baseball videos if I ever show up on Instagram. I don't want to go look at anything else. And so like you can evade it, but the whole system is tilted away from what the content is and more to like what gets the views and what fits these sort of parameters. Once that starts happening, people are making videos that fit those parameters because they know they're going to get the likes, and are all working under this like grand illusion that will lead to them being like massively successful financially, become an international star, do all this. So there's an investment on this weird level into like becoming like a YouTube star and not taking the time to care about the content, but care about like the package that allows you to become the person who owns the Maserati or whatever people's goals are these days.
And there seems to also be in writing generally, but especially in fiction and even maybe poetry even more. Poetry is probably next to philosophy, one of the most abused areas of human thought. But the solipsism, art is communication. To me, art is communication at the highest level. At least it should be aiming for that. But the whole YouTube internet has turned generations, the last couple of generations, into a bunch of solipsists who don't want to get beyond their own experience. You know, I can't. I mean, it used to be, I can't read Moby Dick because there's all those things about whaling there. Who wants to read that? Now it's like, this is the latest AI version of Cthulhu, and
Yeah.
it doesn't have the blue meanies in it or something. I can't get beyond that.
Yeah, yeah, it's very true. And there's like a for a long time the kind of movement, and this probably does dovetail with like the everything from the Reaganomics period onwards in terms of like sort of changing our structural values and what people put effort into. But a lot of effort has changed into becoming a celebrity. Everything's a celebrity. I'm a celebrity. My celebrity experience is therefore valuable. Everything becomes that solipsistic, individualized, like fragmented sort of I like little bit that you're contributing. Your YouTube channel about you and your experience. You're writing about your experience, your identity, your place. That's fine, but it also makes you very manipulatable and like really dismantles this kind of like historic knowledge that one could have of like being able to like think back through the time of like a literary scene, TV history, through any sort of one of these things. That's not super advantageous for like the people, the quote unquote powers that be, that are concerned with making the most money as possible and having control over the masses. The fragmentation and the sort of individuation of everything, and then pumping that up so that you feel like that is a goal and that is something that is achievable, is really going to dismantle the idea of like understanding like a history. Because why does it matter? What matters is what I'm getting on my views and likes today, and what's going to get me more attention and more prominence isn't knowing like Moby Dick's the parts of the whale sections of Moby Dick. It's like being able to put on the makeup in a certain way. That's like a new thing, and get into that algorithm. It's just like it's so much more small in that sense, and so much more like individualized, and that encourages you to just not care. I think a lot of these people just don't care. Like even like I used to have like I mentioned this, like a feeling of shame if someone was talking about an author that seemed very important that I wasn't aware of already. Mm-hmm. I'd feel like, yeah, ooh, I should know that. Let me go find out something. Back in those days, there's no Google, there's no Wikipedia. Like you had to like actually go to the library and figure this out. Now that all those things are available, you could learn a lot more much more quickly. But I think people are like, you haven't read Flaubert? I had a student whose thesis, I was like, the thesis references Palinuro of Mexico by Fernando del Paso, a book that we're reissuing through Delicate Archive in February that I just reread. There's a section of this thesis that's about this book this Venezuelan book that's been translated that's about Palinuro of Mexico. And it's kind of an homage to it. The translator had not read of or heard of the book. And that's something that like I think in a different circumstance you wouldn't do that. You'd be like, oh shit, I need to know this because it's referenced in this thing I'm working on. But now there's not really a shame associated with it. Just like it doesn't matter. Like who cares if I know that or not? Like this is my product. I made this thing. And I don't know where that's coming from, but I feel it all the time. And I have kids that are like 20 to 7, so like I see the ranges of like their impact through social media and what they're doing, and it's disconcerting.
And the thing is, I don't think that, and I'm not talking about your publisher necessarily, but I think publishers don't get it. I'll give you an example. Yesterday, I got home from work. My wife was off. She was watching a documentary about Franz Kafka. Mm-hmm. Okay, you're going to have the usual stuff, the tuberculosis, his big 3 books, his Max Brod not burning his stuff on request, and blah, blah. And she says to me, do you know who is in that? I said, no. She goes, Dave Eggers. I said, Dave Eggers? Okay. I mean, I don't think he doesn't strike me as the brightest bulb, but okay. Then he said, you know who else was in that? I go, no. She goes, Morgan Spurlock. I said, the French fry guy? What? Now here's the thing. I'm thinking that the makers of the film thought, okay, Franz Kafka is this big literary figure. We got Dave Eggers as one of the talking heads, and then we got the French fry guy, because his movie, I guess, around the time this was made, 4 or 5 years afterward, was still well known. And what was it called?
It's called Super Size Me.
Super Size Me. And the thing is, neither French fry guy nor Eggers really said anything about Kafka. It was more about themselves. And so I watched the 2-minute segments of each thing at my wife's direction this one, and I'm like, boy, this is really a shitty documentary. But to me, it had to be that that Morgan Spurlock was then, I guess, a hot filmmaker. So let's put Eggers with his book, which came out a few years before the French Fry movie. Let's put them together because, of course, a guy who talking about McDonald's and a guy who is writing mostly about himself is going to know about the guy who died of tuberculosis when his family and missed dying with the rest of his family in the Holocaust. It makes sense.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, Eggers probably has read some Kafka, but I would suspect that the Spurlock one is just about the metamorphosis and just like using that as like, wow, this really blew my mind. And I can see this already. And this is something that like I wrote an introduction for a book called Chapel Road by Louis Paul Boone that's being reissued next month, and struggled with this because I'd never written an introduction before. But so many of the ones that you look at are like, oh, and here's where I discovered this book. And I had this like grand blah, blah, blah. And it is all self-centered. And that's very much encouraged. So I can imagine this video without having seen it, and I could be totally wrong, but it being like, when I first encountered Kafka was in this class, and it blew my mind and made me aware of the possibilities of fiction and imagination. And there's so much of this, this is how I figured, this is how I encountered it. And that does nothing for like helping talk about literature, helping talk about art in any way, but just feeds into the same trope of like the more individual and celebrity you are, that's what matters. It's not about the work itself. It's not about engaging with it, not about understanding it. It's just like, how can you get more likes out of this?
Yeah, I have a friend who died 3 years ago. He was a poet. He had a lot of problems, addictions, mental problems, whatnot. He died 3 years ago. And these young fellows I know did a documentary on his poetry. And he's a great poet. He could write garbage 99 times out of 100, but that 100th poem would be up there with Archaic Torso of Apollo. But one of the things I did when I wrote an intro for his book, I wrote about a 60-page intro where I was arguing for him being a great poet. He should be read in the canon. And I was saying, he's better than this poet because of this, that. But you don't see, now you would see these kinds of essays 70, 80 years ago with the new directions or with the stuff from the 30s where a publisher or the editor would vigorously put out. But people don't do that anymore because everyone's opinion is subjective. Well, yes, everyone's opinion is subjective, but there's a lot of bad opinions, subjectively or not. Yeah. And do you think that part of the reason, too, is because there is really a lack of belief in the publishing industry, or is it all just money based that we have this watered down situation?
So much money based. Like it's such a huge part of it that gets talked about, is obvious, is super clear, and yet like has this really weird trickle down effect. Like one of the book what is it called? The Business of Books by Andre Schifrin gets into this a bit on like a very simple level, that even as the conglomeration started happening, everyone started buying up, the big presses were buying up these smaller presses, they buy up Pantheon. He talks in that book about like the structure of this, where when you were a publisher in his day in the 80s even, so not that long ago, you would look at your list and you'd know most of these books are going to lose money, but these are important books. One of them will do really well, it'll save the rest of them. That's fine. That's what we exist for, is to do important books that will probably lose money and something will save us. Once he's part of like Random House, they're like, no, you have to fill out a profit and loss sheet for every book, and every book needs to make money. We will not be signing on a book that does not look like it cannot make money. And you can say, but taken in the aggregate, will be successful. And they're like, no, every individual thing has to be successful. That's such a fundamental change in how a publisher would be structured and work. And that has trickled down into a lot of small presses, a lot of indie presses are based that way, of looking at like each book needs to be successful, and less about like doing something from an authentic place. It's much more about chasing what can keep them in business. I struggle with this a lot in thinking about it, of like why there's times that you do books because of any number of reasons. There can be reasons that are like really valid and admirable, and ones that are totally not. But like as long as you know what you're doing, do it. I think that there's been an invasion of some sorts in which the idea where art is the important goal and the communication of art on the highest level is the goal. I don't think that's the goal anymore. I don't get that sense from like most of the people I interact with. There are great people out there that is the case for, but there are a lot that it's like that's secondary, third, tertiary. It's not really on their plate. They're looking at like this book's going to get a lot of attention.
Let me just turn briefly before we wrap up to poetry, because we talked 90% or so on prose and some other arts. Are you familiar with poetry? Are you a poetry reader yourself?
I am much less of a poetry reader than anything else, which is
Okay.
clearly a blind spot. I love hearing people talk about poetry, and I love like they unpack it in various ways. I find that incredibly satisfying. I do not have like the vocabulary and the like skill set to like analyze it in a very like regimented way, and so I always feel like a little at sea. But I do have something to add to that. Go on with your question.
So, uh, poetry obviously never sold well. I mean, yes, you could. There are
Yeah.
probably a handful of books in the early 20th century that might have broken even or made a little bit of
Yes.
money. But I was thinking of, I've got back here the translations of Rilke, whom I mentioned. The two big translators are a guy named Stephen Mitchell and Edward Snow. They're considered
Yeah.
the 1 and 1A of Rilke translations. And there's not much difference between their versions, but that 5%, someone I say, oh, I prefer Mitchell on this, I prefer Snow
Yeah.
on that. But then there were some really bad translations. Some of the earlier translations by a guy named C.F. McIntyre in the early 20th century, and then later ones by Robert Bly. And some of them are just so clunky. And I'm wondering, though, when you have a situation where you have, you know, poetry presses which don't make any money, putting this out there, most of the time this is going to be labors of love, supposedly. And you get these translations, and you see. I wonder what compels people to put out, say, the 27th translation of Beowulf, in the last 100 years, because the first handful would suffice. Okay, maybe 80 years later you do number six, but it seems to me that so much of this, especially in poetry, so much of the air is taken up by their translations and the retranslations of this, that, and the other thing that has been translated 1,000 times before. What can Do you have any insight in
That's
that?
funny. This may go against everything that I said just a second ago. So we did a reissue of or a new translation of Sonnets to Orpheus,
Yeah.
2019, I think, and we had a poetry editor who was selecting one book of poetry every year. So there was their choice, and they chose this book. And the translation itself, it's fine. It's like what you say. Like it's comparable. It has things you might like, things you don't like. It's probably a lot more modern and less, maybe people would like it less than some of the very classic ones. Some people might find it a little bit more approachable. All that becomes a little bit subjective, but overall, like it's good, right? And when we were doing it, it's like, why are we doing this book exactly? There are so many versions, and part of it became then a marketing thing. Like it's the first female translator of the book, who's a native German speaker. And then what we did was made it into a gift book. It became a little small hardcover, which I don't have on the shelf, which is what I was looking for. But a little small hardcover, very attractive, and sold a lot of copies of it. So like we did it because it was selected by a poetry editor with all the best intentions of it being a great new retranslation. But then immediately when it got into the publisher side of things, it was like, what are we going to do with this? And it became all these things I'm saying, like, that's the hook that people are stuck on. We didn't focus from the publishing side on like how can this be marketed as like a great translation. It was like, how can we make this in a semi gimmicky way something that's financially viable? And it was stupidly successful, like way more successful than any poetry book we ever did, like by huge magnitude, like 10 times more than any other best-selling one. And then it was sold as a gift book on counters at bookstores. Pandemic hit and those sales stopped. So like, it did kind of prove my point that I knew what the gimmick was. But to what you're speaking of, I think a lot of that's still that same appeal. If you put someone in there, like if we did reissues of like Tristram Shandy even, we'd have a better chance of selling that than a new Slovenian author that you've never heard of before. Like we could just pop that in, these old books, like a reissue of something that's in public domain, or a new translation of someone that everyone knows of, a new Kafka translation. That will give us a baseline sales to allow us to take risks. If you don't take those risks though, then I don't know what you're doing. If you're just doing those kind of things, I don't believe in it. I think you have to be swinging all the time.
So I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about reading in the near future and beyond. And I have to bring up, of course, AI because, like I said, what is passing for AI now is not actually AI.
Yeah.
If because I've spoken to people who are in there, and this is not what is going to. But people think, oh, it's going to be Terminators.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
it's going to be the
No, that's
Matrix.
in six.
Or
That's
it's
in
going to be
6 months.
Utopia.
Yeah, we still got 6 months. Good, we got
Yeah,
good 6 months.
yeah. And the thing, my own personal opinion is, I've heard so much of these ads that come out. I think this AI, which is not really AI, LLMs, is going to be a bubble that's going to burst. And I think it's a
I
good
hope
thing
so.
because if it does burst, people will be a hell of a lot more cautious, and Donald Trump will be long dead by then. People will be a hell of a lot more cautious in 20 years when it comes around again, and then the middle of the century will do that. And I also believe that we're not going to have the doomsday because of sex bots. I think humans are going to want to fuck big-breasted sex bots, or well, maybe a few lesbians too. But anyway, regarding reading and writing, okay, there's all this hand-wringing about the writing with AI, and we've talked basically about the laziness of modern readers, and it seems to me that AI, when it becomes real AI, is going to make human beings, they're going to lose the desire to read, perhaps, or you might end up with this giant amorphous gray mass. How do we in a society that is heading towards greater technology reinterest people in something that only takes place in the mind? To me, that's the greatest thing about reading is, my Ahab looks nothing like your Ahab. My Huck Finn is going to look a little bit different than yours. My Madame Bovary is different than yours. We all, these are the reading makes movies in our minds, and everyone is their own director in a sense.
Yeah.
So how do we go from a technology that seems to want to make us dumber and lazier than we already are to going back to something where we are the primary agent?
In some ways, like I agree with you that it should explode the bubble and that it should like run its course. And there's the problem of AI in terms of its quality, like what it's able to generate and what it's able to like replicate. Like I use it for one of my tests in my class is I have something translated by AI versus the translation by a human and make them judge it. And they're fooled regularly by the AI and think that that's a real person. So there's some level of competency that brings up questions on like, what are we looking at when we look at, what are we evaluating when we talk about something that's AI written versus human writing? What are we doing? But the problem that I think isn't even that level. I think the problem with AI that I see is that it just proliferates. It makes so much stuff and it makes a lot of lies, and those lies then spin out and become kind of truths because they're repeated. So when you go online onto social media, there's so much that is just replicated AI that's being reshared and reshared and reposted and removed that like there's estimates that 85% of what you just randomly see is not real, right? It's artificial. And it's just coming more and more and more and more and more. It's like a pipeline. Like at any point in time, right now, there are probably like in this country alone, 10 million people making some AI image thinking that it'll be like some funny meme and then it'll pop up and get replicated. There is so much of that my dumb utopic hope, my I want to live in the woods and don't want to be part of the society hope is that people are going to be like, I don't want this.
Yeah.
There's too much of everything and none of it's real. I don't know what's real anymore. And then at that point in time, there's this like infrastructure of art and culture and books that exist where people can be like, I don't need this. I can have something that's authentic. Here's a book by myself and this exchange. And that will be like the sort of the pendulum swing back away from like this, make it all be excessive and go back to like, let's get like, this was a mistake. This is a mistake. There's too much nonsense and I can't figure out what's going on anymore. Probably require like a whole generation to be like a burnt over generation of like just like dismantled minds that are like incapable of like thinking through any of this, but the next one will be good.
It's interesting because I was reading something online about AI generating information based off of other information, and I think now it said with within a month or so ago of when the article was written. What you see online is about what you said. It's about 80% AI and 20% real factual, real human developed stuff. But one of the dangers of especially these large language models and even the real AI is large language models are basically dart tossers, and they look and they can do it so quickly that they're basically gambling on what you meant or what you said. And at a certain point, when you get to like 99.999999% AI, this whole thing is going to topple over like a tower because, and this isn't just regular reading for pleasure. The stuff that's written, scientific papers, the science is going to be so divergent from what's out there in the real world that they're not going to be able to. AI isn't going to be able to function. Now, there probably is some kind of a solution that's going to have to come along. But it's interesting because I was also reading up because I knew I'd have to get to talk to AI in this show. I was looking up AI and saying, I looked up, put a term, AI will fail. And I said, AI overrated or AI bubble. And at the third one, a chat GPT, and I was just Googling. I wasn't using chat GPT, but the chat GPT comes up and says, given your last few entries, you seem like you're depressed. Now,
oh my God!
Now it's like I'm looking up something factual, but the thing is trying to psychoanalyze why I put in these last 3 or 4 buzzwords or something to look up, and it just seems so hilarious because actually, if I were to step back and didn't know this was a Turing test and I thought this was a human being writing it, I'd say, boy, this person has a little bit more sensitivity than your average reader.
That's amazing. That's amazing. It's so invasive. Like, I have to remember always to put in the -AI into my Google searches because otherwise that first one pops up and I'll start looking and I'm like,
oh, you use the minus symbol, -AI, and then
it won't run. It'll just be like the normal search.
That's good to
so
know.
you can remove it that way from Google, which is like super handy to know because it is everywhere. I go on I open up a PDF to like compare the past printing of a book to a new one to make sure that we got all the scans right. And it immediately is like, would you like AI to summarize this book? And I was like, why? Why? No, I don't need AI in my PDFs. I don't need it in my Microsoft Word. I don't need it in Excel. I don't need it anywhere for any of this stuff. Like, let it be what it should have been made for, which is like helping dumb business people write dumb business emails and like let everything else go.
Yeah, I know. It's like I don't need you to add Halle Berry into my photo from 1997 and my trip to Puerto Rico.
Right, exactly. There's a great podcast called Shell Game by Evan Ratliff that's about, it's like there's a second season coming, but the first season's maybe 6 episodes about playing with voice agent AI, where it like imitates his voice and does things like sees a psychologist and various other stuff, and he like tests the limits of AI under that regard. And it's very interesting. It brings up a lot of these philosophical questions, and he comes to a conclusion like you do, like it's asymptotic. Like you get closer and closer, and then it's just like it doesn't ever quite get there, and it doesn't work, and it'll just implode under its own weight at some point.
So, final question then, as someone who works in the publishing industry, how big a problem do most people in the industry, if at all, see the low quality of reading and low quality readers? Is this something that is thought of as manageable, or is this something that we're just heading towards the wall and fuck it?
Heading towards the wall and fuck it. I was at a conference in New York. I spoke at a conference for, it's called the U.S. Book Show, trade show, that was sponsored by Publishers Weekly or put together by them. And the vast number of panels that went on outside of mine were like, how to use AI to generate this, how to do this, how to bring this about. And the general vibe going back years, I had a conversation with a VP from Hachette back in France in like 2010, 2009. And they were like, we were doing all these surveys to understand readership. And she was like, I wanted them to include some information to find out like what percentage of books that are purchased are read. Like, do people just buy these or do they read them? Like, what happens to the books afterwards and when do they read them? And the CEO and the people putting this together were like, we don't give a shit about that. If the book is sold, that's all we care about. Why do we worry about like if someone reads it or engages? We don't care. And I think that is now like writ large because there's this way of like, there's a model that exists where the more that you can generate and push out there, the more likely you are to have a hit, and the more likely you are as a company to survive. And at this point in time, like, a lot of these publishers are just companies trying to survive and aren't like, don't see themselves as part of a culture, as creating a culture, but simply as like a self-replicating, LLC or whatever. Like, that's wrong, but Inc. or whatever it is. Like, they want to be successful as a financial entity, not as a culture making entity.
It seems that Henry Ford and the whole consumer model seems to have won, or at least, at least temporarily. Maybe there will be a reprieve in the future. But Chad Post, it was good talking with you about this subject. So thank you very much.
Thank you.